All right, it looks like we're streaming live. Are we good to go?
Yes, you are.
All right, thanks, Noel.
No problem.
Well, good evening, everyone. We want to thank you for your participation in tonight's meeting. We're excited to share the results of some valuable archaeology work that's been recently completed at the city's Oakwood Cemetery. My name is Chris Andrews. I'm with the City of High Point's Planning and Development Department. And so tonight you'll hear from a couple different folks who have been a part of this work. First, we'll hear from Dave Fensel in our Planning and Development Department, kind of talk about the history, how this work was kind of brought up by the Historic Preservation Commission, and then the associated grant that went along with it. Then next, we'll hear from our consultants, Sarah Lowry and Maeve Herrick with New South Associates, and they're going to present us some great data and graphics as they get through their presentation. Then we'll hear from the city's Development Service or Public Services Department, who maintains the cemetery, and what the results of this work will mean for any operations or anything at the cemetery. So then we'll move into an opportunity for questions and answers. And we haven't received any questions from anybody at this point, but if you do have some as we go along, feel free to put them in the webinar chat and we will get those answered. We are recording the meeting, so it'll be viewable at a later date, especially if there's members of the community that weren't able to join us tonight. It'll be accessible to them as well. As we get into the discussion or into the presentation, there'll be mention of the report. That is something that we will have both in hard copy for the city, as well as a digital document that we will notify folks a little bit later or in the near future where that document will be stored and accessible for all to read. And then finally, if anyone's not presenting at this point, we'll go ahead and mute ourselves just in case there's any background distractions or anything until we get to the Q&A session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Fensel.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. This is kind of the result of quite a few years of effort to get to where we are tonight. For a number of years, the city's Historic Preservation Commission had expressed interest in trying to raise awareness of the city's Oakwood and Green Hill cemeteries. And specifically, there was a lot of interest in the African American section or colored section of Oakwood. The idea for doing an archaeological survey of the African American section at Oakwood came about by the Historic Preservation Commission when they were reviewing a historic marker that was approved and erected in 2016. It was felt by members of the commission that we did not have a real good understanding of the area and all the resources that it contained. There was a lot of discussion. It's known several prominent early Black settlers of High Point that are buried in this area. But other than that, we really didn't have a good idea on the number or the extent of the graves. And so after that discussion, one of our commission members at the time, Dorothy Darr, developed a draft proposal for an archaeological survey using ground penetrating radar, I believe after discussing it with New South Associates at that time, and drafted a proposal and got some numbers together of what it would take to survey the area. As a certified local government, historic certified local government in North Carolina, the city of High Point is eligible to apply for a yearly grant from the State Historic Preservation Office that utilizes federal pass-through grant funds. We applied for a grant in 2019. The grant request totaled $8,000. with the city contributing $4,800 and $3,200 from the state. We were successful in securing this competitive grant and were notified in summer of 2019. In early 2020, or earlier this year, we developed an RFP that was distributed to qualified consultants, and we were very fortunate to be able to select New South Associates to do the archaeological survey work for us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Let me share my screen. We at New South Associates we're an archaeological consulting firm. We really do cultural resource consulting, history, archaeology. And Maeve and I specifically work in our geophysics department, and we do all kinds of geophysical projects. And we do work in a lot of historic cemeteries. So I am going to kind of kick off the talk, just talking about, or kick off the results, sort of talking about the project, the part of the project that we bid on and the work that we are completing for this project. And then I'm going to kind of go into how ground penetrating radar works in cemeteries, just give a really brief background on how it works. And then Maeve is going to jump in and discuss the results specifically at Oakwood. So this project was, the work was conducted in kind of 3 phases dictated by our contract and in that RFP that David talked about. The first was, well, here, sorry, I have a slide here sort of outlining what I'm going to talk about, what I just said here. The first phase was doing the GPR data collection, the marker mapping, the data processing, and producing that technical report that Chris talked about. This was the bulk of the work, included all the work we did out in the field and everything we're going to present tonight. And that everything we're talking about tonight is summarized in that report, or discussed in more detail in that report, really. And I think David and Chris said that it would be available to in various ways. And we actually just sent the final report out today. The second phase of the project is to mark the possible graves that were identified on the ground. And I think Robbie's going to talk about that a little later here. But that will be something that we're going to go out and do as soon as we are sure we have all the supplies on hand. Hopefully it will take place before the end of the year. And then the third section, part of our contract, was the public presentation of the results, which is where we are today. So I'm going to just go over very briefly how GPR works in cemeteries. So ground penetrating radar works through transmitting electromagnetic energy into the ground. That energy reflects off of changes below the ground. And then the strength and the time elapsed that energy travels is recorded in the receiving antenna. And this gives us the contrast is that strength, and the time that it travels is used as a proxy for depth below the ground. And so in the slide here, you can see the computer that sends the energy, and this is sort of a simplified version of how the antenna works, where you send energy into the ground, it reflects off of changes. And this is the profile, the black and white kind of squiggly lines there is what a GPR profile looks like, what all those various pulses of energy recorded look like. In cemeteries, it will look, a little different. I'm going to get into that here in a second. But the main point that I wanted to talk about is that GPR Works functions through looking at contrasts below the ground. So there has to be a contrast between what you're trying to map and the ground. And I always like to talk about what GPR is not, because probably everyone here knows this, but popular culture really depicts GPR kind of differently. In the slide on the bottom right here, you can see the skeleton. We are typically not mapping skeletons or actual bones below the ground. It's not as quick as TV, and there's a lot more systems to it. We're working in systematic grids and recording a lot of data along the way. And coming up with the results that we're going to talk about tonight requires a lot of very careful data processing and analysis. It's not quite as fast as walking around and saying, oh, dig here. And this is some data from Oakwood. So just to give an example of what a profile of GPR data looks like. And we collect hundreds of these profiles across the cemetery. The profile is on the right in black and white. And we have it annotated here so you can see what we're looking for below the ground. And what we do is manually go through each and every one of these profiles and select what looks like possible graves. And we're looking for both these kind of geometry. You see the hyperbolas here outlined in this green circle and this purple circle. And we're also looking for those to continue in multiple profiles to be the approximate size and shape of graves. We also take all those profiles and produce something we call a slice map, and Maeve will talk about that, slice maps, when she talks. And those are what you see here in the purple, the green with the red. And slice maps are kind of they're used as a compilation. We take all those profiles, we line them up and create a 3D block of data, and then we slice down horizontally through the ground. And each of these slice maps can be used. Sometimes you can visually see graves, like you can see an outline in white here, some very strong red, almost rectangle shapes. And sometimes it doesn't look like we're seeing anything at all, or sometimes it looks like there's green and yellow blobs that we didn't call out as graves. And that's because when we looked at those in profile view, we didn't see those characteristics of graves. So it's kind of, we go back and forth between the two. And what I really wanted to emphasize here is that it's a kind of an arduous manual process. And we're going, we spend a lot of time trying to go back and forth through the data and identify possible graves. And there's also the possibility that we can miss graves in a cemetery. That's partly because of that discussion of contrast I was saying earlier. Grave has to have contrast with the ground to be imaged with the electromagnetic energy. So in order to reflect electromagnetic energy, the grave has to be different than the ground surface. And if a grave has been in the ground for a long time, it will gradually take on the characteristics of the soil around it, particularly if that person was not buried in what we would think of as a formal burial container, which many of the people buried out here may not have been. These are very early burials, and people may not have had access to the same kind of mortuary materials that we think of today. The other thing is we may identify graves that are not actually graves. There may be a tree root that is just the right size and shape of a grave. And we do try and eliminate tree roots and not call them out as graves when we see them. Sometimes if they look a little bit like a grave, we're still going to pull it out as a grave, because in our from our perspective, we would prefer to have false positives. We prefer to say there's a grave there when there isn't, and protect it, as opposed to missing graves. So we try to err on the side of too many. So the next part of the methods I'm going to talk about is the marker mapping. Part of our contract was to go out and do marker mapping. So only in the African American section, we took two instruments out there. One is called the Rtk Gps, which John is holding on the right. You can see he's holding that long pole and the black stick. And on the left, there's a yellow tripod, and that is the total station. And what we do here is we're just recording 4 points at the edge of each marker. And we're going to take that data, and I'm going to go back a slide here. And we are going to put all those markers on a map. I think, sorry, it will be in the next slide here. Put all those markers on the map, and we're going to compare that to the GPR data. And that way we'll be able to put on our maps whether graves were marked or unmarked and what kind of marker they were marked with. So we kind of pulled together, not all of these are from the Oakwood Cemetery, but we just sort of pulled together a compilation of the different kinds of markers we found at the Oakwood Cemetery. When we did that marker map, we indicate what kind of marker each of the markers are on the map. So, which is particularly helpful when you have something like a double headstone. And so we can say, oh, well, there are 2 GPR anomalies associated with that. Okay, Maeve, do you want to talk about the results?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. So with the total station mapping that we did, we digitized 99 separate markers. But once we kind of put those into space and figured out, you know, which headstone went with which footstone and stuff like that, we said that there were 90 individual graves that are marked. And so in some cases, like one marker can count for multiple people, like if there's a double headstone. And then in other cases, when there's a headstone and a footstone, those are 2 markers that count for 1 person. So it's not always that one-to-one relationship. So in the table that's on this slide, you can see how I kind of broke down the counts of each marker versus how I counted those for individual graves in the cemetery. So for example, when we had the base of a headstone that was, you know, where it had been for decades, right next to the fallen part of that headstone, we would map both of those in, but we would just count that as, you know, 1 marker together and marking 1 grave. So then in addition to the marked graves, we also mapped in 84 grave depressions. And so grave depressions happen when coffins have collapsed over time. And so the soil on top of them has sunken. It can also happen a little bit with soil compaction. And 82 of the 84 grave depressions are unmarked. And it's interesting, you can see on the map that there's almost as many depressions as there are marked graves in the cemetery. There were also 6 marker depressions. So that's, those were spots like at the head of a grave depression that looked like a marker had been there at one point. And so we mapped those in as well. And so just with marker mapping, when we and the mapping of the depressions, when we combined those, we found that there were 176 individual graves. And then we also mapped in 16 non-mortuary features that don't actually contribute to the count of individual graves, but we did use them when we were interpreting the GPR data to kind of see where certain graves were. So there are a few family plot walls that we mapped in. And so we found a number of anomalies that fell within the wall, but were not marked individually. And so we ended up kind of categorizing those separately. Yeah, Sarah, I think I'm ready for the next slide. So this is a map of the GPR results. There's a lot going on, but that's because we found 406 graves in the GPR data. 66 of these are marked. 15 of them are unmarked, but in a family plot wall that we had mapped. 61 are unmarked, but were closely associated with a depression that we had mapped in. So even though they're not marked with a marker, we did categorize those separately because there is like a surface feature that has been correlated with it. There were 264 that were unmarked and not associated with a depression. So those are just 264 grave anomalies that we found that there's no like surface indication of them. So the average depth that we found was 40 centimeters below the surface for the graves. And that can vary a lot depending on what part of the grave has been reflected to produce the anomalies. So if the bottom of the grave shaft is what's being reflected, it's going to seem much deeper than if it's the top of a casket or the edge of a grave shaft closer to the surface. And then the age of the graves can also create a lot of difference between the depth of graves. So older graves, of course, were excavated by hand, and then newer graves are often excavated with like machinery, so they can vary that way. So when we correlated the marked GPR anomalies with the marker map that we had made, 66 of the mapped graves have corresponding anomalies, and then 24 have no anomaly. So that's in addition to, well, we had already included those in the marker map, but they were just, so they're marked graves that just don't have a GPR anomaly associated with them. And Sarah talked about how, you know, sometimes graves can be marked, but if they're of a certain age or for, you know, a number of reasons, they just didn't produce enough contrast for us to pick up with the GPR. So as I said, 61 of the graves are associated with the depression that we had mapped in. But then there were also 25 depressions that we had mapped that were not associated with an anomaly. That's, you know, a similar scenario where we could see that there was a grave there based on what we could see on the surface, but for whatever reason, there wasn't enough contrast for it to be detected with radar. So by combining, oh, Sarah, can you go to the next slide, please? So this table kind of outlines all of that. And so we have the marked graves, and then how many of them are associated with the GPR anomaly, how many of them are not associated with an anomaly. And then we have the same thing for the depressions. And so when you combine the 406 total grave anomalies that we found in the GPR and add the 24 marked graves that did not have an associated anomaly and the 25 unmarked depressions that also didn't have an anomaly, we get 455 total graves in this section of the cemetery. And that's a lot, but that kind of result is not uncommon for cemeteries of this age and type. You know, there's a lot of reasons why so many of these are unmarked. Wood markers decompose, and you know, these are over 100 years old, so it's likely that at one point they were marked with wooden markers that have just decomposed by now. Also, they may have been marked with field stones and funeral home markers that have been removed either intentionally or accidentally. Often these are just, you know, they get moved accidentally with landscaping activities, and just so then the graves, you know, they look like they're unmarked, but really the markers have just been moved. And of course, there's always a few where they may have not been marked to begin with. Sarah, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so where do we go from here? As we saw, there are a lot of unmarked graves, and many of them are close to the edges of this section. So it's just important that any sort of ground disturbance in this area is avoided. Like what we see above the ground, even with depressions and markers and everything, is really not representative of what's below. And so it's just really important that any sort of like construction activity or anything nearby is aware of the cemetery and unmarked graves that are in the cemetery. And then I guess there's just, there has been a lot of historic research going on with the cemetery. I know Phyllis Bridges and Linda Willard have done a lot of work looking into obituaries and trying to figure out who was actually buried here. And they're going to be publishing a book. So that's a lot of really great work that's been going on. So yeah, looking into documentations to help learn like who was buried here will be really helpful. Looking into death certificates and obituaries, census records, oral histories. A lot of times people know where their ancestors are buried, even if there's no written record of it. And even though, we may never know exactly who's buried in each unmarked grave, I mean, that would be impossible. We could kind of, figure out the names of more people who are buried here. Even if we can't say, exactly which grave, we could narrow it down to this section of the cemetery. It's also an opportunity for education. There's already a sign there, but it might be nice to have some sort of monument or memorial that could include the names of people we know are there in an unmarked grave. And then sort of the inverse of looking through documents to figure out who's buried here, the cemetery can also provide information about people who there may be no record of them outside of the cemetery. So just by looking at the names of the marked graves and the family names and looking at censuses and stuff like that, we might be able to find people who this is the only record of them. And this is just a really great opportunity. This is an important piece of High Point history. And as I said before, historians have been doing a lot of work with it. And it's really exciting to see that there's still more to be done. Sarah, sorry, Sarah, did you want to jump in? Okay, sorry.
We just wanted to thank everyone who helped us out with this project. There was a lot of different people who supported this project, both our field work and supported the grants. And we were really honored to get to participate and be part of this in our little GPR way, and can't wait to see what happens next with taking this information. And I'm eager to hear about the historical research that's being done and how the GPR can help that. So
awesome. Well, thank you, ladies, for that presentation. And so, like Maeve said, with some of the what are some of the future actions that can be taken? Robbie Stone with our Public Services Department. Robbie, do you want to share with us what the plan is for marking at the cemetery and what you guys have been doing to try to prepare to preserve some of the data?
Yes, sir. And I've also got Trevor Spencer's here with us. So Trevor may want to chime in and add to this as well. First, I'd like to thank everybody that's been involved in this project. We have known for a number of years that obviously there's a number of unmarked graves in that area. And now at least we are more confident that we have a closer to exact number so that we can better try to preserve and take care and honor those who are buried in the cemetery there. So I want to thank everybody that was participating in that. We are and have been for a little while working on a digital mapping location of our cemetery. So this will obviously be incorporated into that. hopefully that'll be something we can present in another year or so that folks can just basically log on to the city website and have some access to do some research there as well. We did receive the markers last week. We ordered 455 markers. It's a stainless steel disc, and each one has a number stamped in it. So with number 1 through 455. We do plan on working with New South, in a few weeks, probably well on after the Thanksgiving holiday, to maybe get those set in the right place as it lines up with their survey and their locations there. We will do plan on printing a map and having it in the office there too. So we'll have a hard copy in the office for folks that may come and have some interest in it, so they can have access to that, as well as in the future they'll have access to our electronics mapping as well. As Maeve, I believe, mentioned, we'll not know who are in the graves. But at least I feel better now knowing that we have locations, knowing a more exact number, and then also, as it was mentioned, we've been very careful doing any work in that area. Let's say a tree falls, we have to get in there to get the tree out, but now we can have these markers so that we know, hey, we definitely can't access it through this location. We need to go around or stay to this side to get around there. So that brings another level of comfort too, if we do have to get in there with some type of equipment to work in that area. The interactive map, as I mentioned, we're looking at that next calendar year to be accessed for the public. Hopefully that will be very beneficial for everybody. But again, we are excited about this. Very thankful for everybody that's participated in it. And I'm just looking forward to continuing to learn more about this and preserve it. And I know Brad Embry, who's our supervisor out there, he has a heart for the cemetery. He definitely has a heart for the folks that have loved ones buried in there, and his desire is to make that the nicest facility in High Point. And he's, if you are familiar with the facility, starting say 4 or 5 years ago, Brad has done wonders out there, and I know he'll continue to do that, and this will be one more step to him preserving that area as well. Trevor, did you have anything that you'd like to add, or maybe something I missed?
No, I would echo everything that you said. I think you covered it really well. Like you said, Brad's been a big proponent of this project for years too. So the fact that we were able to accomplish this with grant funding was a major benefit to the city as well. And I think that it's great that we were able to take this extra step of due diligence in that area and put forth this effort to do all that we could. So. But like you said, Brad and those guys, they do a great job of maintaining those grounds. They take great pride in it. And I know the community has definitely noticed that over the last few years. So appreciate everybody's involvement.
Thank you, guys. I haven't seen anybody type any questions in on the side. But at this point, if there's anybody that does have any questions, that we would love to get those answered. So I don't know if you just unmute yourself and ask the question, we can certainly get to those.
Hello, everyone. This is Phyllis Bridges. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done. Linda and I are so excited about this. We were so excited to get this information with the total numbers. And we just want to thank the city of High Point, Robbie and Brad and all those guys in the cemetery division. You have done an awesome job, and thank you for everything. One of my questions is, can you tell if there is a child or an adult buried in a grave by the size of it? I know we have a few children buried there.
We usually don't try and guess for a couple reasons. You can look at them. We didn't specify in the report, So I'll start with that. But you can definitely look at the anomalies and see that some are smaller and some are larger. One of the reasons we don't try and hypothesize whether they're children or adults, because particularly child graves can be very hard to identify, because historically the way they were buried was typically even shallower than adult graves because they were digging smaller holes. At least that's what our mortuary archaeologist tells me. And you know, kind of for that reason, we just, because it's really hard to tell what the exact length of the burial is when we're doing the GPR anomaly kind of analysis too, because we're looking at the shape of the excavated grave shaft too. So we don't really hypothesize back and forth whether they're child or adult graves, at least, but some of them very well could be. So I definitely wouldn't rule that out.
Okay, because we did come across a couple of articles that indicate that some couple of the children are buried there, but there's no markers. So I was just wondering if you could kind of tell. And one more question.
Sure.
That dome-shaped tomb that's near Jess Edmonds' family plot. What is that? Was there anything in there shaped like a dome? It's all brick on the top, kind of rounded on the top, long. You guys remember that one?
Unmute yourself, Maeve.
Okay, sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. I do remember which one you're talking about. We mapped that in, but because it's raised, we didn't collect GPR over it. Going over something like that, it's not really good for the structure, and it can also it can mess with the lengths of our GPR transects. So we didn't go over it, so I can't tell you if there was an anomaly in there or not. But I think we just mapped it in there as a vault. So that's sort of the interpretation that we had in the field.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all I have.
Well, thank you for everything. You were very, very helpful in our work. So thank you.
Well, you're so welcome. Anything I can do to help.
And Ms. Bridges, I want to echo that. Thank you for being an advocate. There's things like this at the city we want to accomplish, and it's folks like you that help us to accomplish that. So thank you for all your help.
No, you're so welcome.
Any others with questions?
Yes, I'm Reverend Webb, pastor of Greater First United Baptist Church, and certainly thank you for sharing the information as well as for the invitation to be on the line. Greatly appreciate it. Certainly enlightening information. And I noticed that Robbie had shared that you all will not be able to identify in particular individuals who are laid to rest in those various burial locations. But will that marker plot that he made reference to, will that be made public in the event that we can share that with members of our respective churches who might have family members who have been historically buried there?
Yes, sir. So those markers will all be numbered 1 through 455, and then we'll have those. Those will be added into our digital mapping. Plus, we'll have our plan is to actually have a hard copy, a physical map within the office, showing those markers on a map and where they're located. Again, we'll not necessarily know whose body is located or associated with that marker, but we will have that information, that numerical information available.
Okay, thank you. Do you think within the foreseeable future that it would be possible to perhaps somehow correlate a name with those burials, or that would be virtually impossible to do that?
I may ask for Sarah and Maeve. I'm not aware of how we would accomplish that, but I may ask for the opinions of Sarah and Maeve on that.
It's not possible with GPR. However, if people from your churches are familiar and there's some sort of oral memory of where people might be buried, and it might not be exact, but I don't know if there's a way for the city to record if they, could say, well, we know that this is someone related to us. The only other ways would be through invasive means to identify who they are, and I don't think that would be something the city, to have to talk to the city about that. But if there's an oral history of it, maybe there's a way to associate a person's name with a number. That'd be a question for the city, I guess, if they have a way to take that information in.
And just another kind of thought, not looking at individual graves, but if we were to look at sort of those family plots where there were anomalies identified in them that didn't have individual markers, or grave anomalies that we found near family markers, or just near group like clusters of graves with marked with the same last name. So like grave anomalies that were like identified in those family plots or near family markers might be part of that family or be closely related to that family. I mean, of course, like you can never know for sure, but it can get you a little bit closer, I think, in that way.
Okay, thanks a lot. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and I agree. If there's some information out there leading us to believe a certain individual is associated with this specific location, just randomly pick, say it's number 203, then I think we could record that information with it, that name with that number, if family members have, I guess, maybe some historical data to help us understand that. And we would just probably need to notate that how while we're recording it that way, that it's believed to be the location of this person.
Okay.
Now, if I can,
Well, I guess while Phyllis is trying to unmute, I'll pose my other question. Certainly, again, this is very exciting information, and I'm excited to be a part of it and applaud you all for the work that you all have done. One of the things that I typically encounter as a pastor, and sometimes during the interment, for family members who are encountering like a financial hardship and they're unable to purchase a marker at that particular time. What is the probably average time frame, as you had noted earlier, sir, before the remains almost become integrated with the soil, and it's very difficult to determine if a body was placed in that particular area? And that way it can give the family a timeline in terms of when they should be considering purchasing a marker.
So it really varies depending on the soils, but one thing I will say is modern burials today, I think it's required, Robbie might be able to answer this, but I think people are required to use a concrete vault in the cemetery, and those are going to last. I've yet to not find a concrete vault with GPR. So if we're in a concrete vault in the modern period, a grave, I think it's less of a concern as far as GPR being able to identify the remains. In historic cemeteries, it really varies a lot depending on the ground soil conditions. I know it's a wishy-washy answer, but if there's a lot of moisture, people can take on the characteristics of the ground faster than a more dry environment. It depends on how deep they're buried. The deeper, I think it will be a little slower the deeper the burial is. It's very, it's very variable. And I will also point out that one of the reasons Maeve talked about markers that didn't have associated GPR anomalies, Now, some of those could be because we weren't able to image the grave with GPR, and some of those could be because of the reason you mentioned, that people came back later to mark the grave, and they might have just been off a little bit because they didn't quite remember exactly where they were going to put that monument. So they may never have marked a grave. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a really good point. And we always err on the side of, if there's a marker there, there's someone there, whether regardless if we identify it with GPR or not, in order just to have that extra layer of protection. But it's possible there isn't.
Going back to trying to identify individuals, Linda Wheeler and I do have several newspaper articles that indicate certain people were buried there. So we have names, there's just no marking. So if Reverend Webb, if you have a church member who knows that they had a family member buried there, they could reach out to us and we can see if we have that name. Some of the last names are some of the names that go that far back. Say, for instance, like the Graves family. That name is still popular and around now.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Phyllis. And Phyllis, do you have a contact information that you can share either in the chat or somebody, some other names? Okay.
Well, thank you all. If there's any other questions, speak up now, or otherwise we will certainly notify those who attended the meeting today, as well as whoever we sent out a notification. We will let you know where the documents and if we can link to the video at all, where these items will be stored for reference. And then if there's any questions about the presentation or the report, once we receive it, we're happy to share, and go ahead and you can contact our office at the Planning and Development Department. So yeah, thank you. If there's any other parting comments, otherwise we can depart. But I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you for our communication staff for setting everything up and making sure that we were online and recorded. So thank you guys back at City Hall.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Night, everybody.
Night. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye.